So welcome to the team. We're going to another district plan session, and then we'll also have a Q&A session which includes our commissioners. But over to you, Sean.
Thank you, Your Worship. Now, I understand you've had a very busy day today. So what we'll do is move swiftly on to the consideration of the independent hearing panel's recommendations on the city centre zone, the Tanako Civic Square precinct, the Waterfront zone, and the design guides and wind chapters and outcomes contributions that go with that. We don't have a introduction to the planning system today. I'm sorry to disappoint you all. I can only draw so quickly. The next one will be with your next briefing, the briefing after next, and we will be going through how you make amendments to recommendations and what that system looks like. Very good. So the split between these two chapters is the ISPP matters are on the left, the standard planning processes are on the right. And with that, I will hand over to Mr. Wharton, who has joined me at the table.
Thank you. Tēnā koutou. Good afternoon, councillors, Mayor. The presentation will be similar to the one we had yesterday, but given the topics are slightly unique, I'll start with what the panel considered and then what their recommendations are for each of them. So first, you won't see this, so I'll skip through, but just briefly to mention that the waterfront zone is a new zone for this proposed plan. Previously, it was integrated with the city centre, with just a Lambton Harbour area, and just pointing out that the waterfront zone is different from the city centre in that city centre is more about maximising development capacity, building heights, high denser nature, whereas your waterfront is more about connecting the city to the sea, protecting the heritage, being a special place. So with that in mind, I'll move on to the city centre zone, which excludes that waterfront area. So the panel were kept in the front of their minds about the NPSUD, so National Policy Statement, urban development direction on how to realise as much development capacity as possible within that zone. They looked at applications for rezoning from city centre zone from some residents on more the outskirts of the city centre who wanted to be rezoned or downzoned to something different in areas like in Thorndon and Upper Willow Street, etc. The submitters raised the issues with sunlight access and the need for building heights and setbacks to be lower, particularly next to residential and character and heritage areas. The panel considered about any new activities that should be enabled within the zone. They looked at high density housing, so it's whether there should be provisions for quality, affordability, accessibility, and they also looked at things like the residential unit sizes and outdoor space and amenity, and even took up an invite to go on a little site visit to a small apartment area. They also considered design panel, how that might work, and just phrasing changes to specific provisions. So the panel found that when it came to maximum heights, that in order to give proper effect to that national direction, that they should be height thresholds rather than maximum heights. So the effect of that would be that if a building goes above that height, that the council would have more items to assess. Or that they could assess for that application. If you think back to yesterday when Sean was talking about the different types of activities, and you talked about permitted and then controlled where it had to be granted, and then restricted discretionary where you could approve or decline or put conditions just on some matters, this is where this is fitting in. So the activity stays restricted discretionary, but just more matters get added on once it goes over that height threshold. The panel supported retaining the minimum height within the city centre zone as well at 22 metres, which is approximately 6 stories. As has been mentioned before, the panel recommended that the city centre zone south of the Basin Reserve be rezoned to a mixed-use zone, but to have a precinct over it, which would keep the height of 42.5 as notified in the plan, but because it's mixed-use zone, that would become a maximum height rather than this threshold that we talked about before. Also just noting that the precinct carries through some of the design guidelines from that and policies that come through from the city centre zone, but it is a much shorter version of them. For example, the mixed-use zone wouldn't have veranda or active frontage controls. And the things I'll talk about soon in terms of city development outcomes go through as design outcomes, so a much more simplified version. There was an area of 21 to 45 Hania Street, which is in the city centre zone in Mount Victoria, which is right next to the Moore Street Heritage area. So the panel agreed with the submitters that there should be a greater setback for the building capacity there. So the height threshold for those buildings in Hania Street would be dropped from 28.5 metres down to 15 metres. And the height to boundary, so that's this kind of building envelope that goes up and angles in, would be dropped from 8 metres and 60 degrees down to 5 metres and 60 degrees. So there's more potential for sunlight and less overshadowing should that area develop. The panel supported the protection of sunlight access to public spaces within the zone. They added parliamentary government civic activities just to be specific that these things are encouraged here. They supported retaining the restrictions on car parking at ground level as an inefficient use of space, but noting that it could happen at ground level if it was part of a building down behind the rear. They added a specific policy for retirement villages and also supported addition of a new method about using an urban design panel. So this is a method, not so much a rule, so it's more how council would use it in considering applications. This, the method would be, council would seek to do this and facilitate it, but it would be subject to funding and approval. So if that wasn't approved in the long-term plan process, this wouldn't override that long-term plan process. So moving on to Tenako Civic Square. The few submitters on this is my summary, but generally fell into two camps. One who sought to use the precinct to preserve the civic buildings there, the green open space and the sunlight, and others who saw that the precinct could be used to enable more staged redevelopment for earthquake strengthening hazards and changing needs. And the panel acknowledged that second viewpoint in terms of removing references to the civic administration building and the municipal office building, given that uncertainty about demolition, recognising that there could be educational and government activities, so same as in the city centre zone. The height limit, as notified in the plan, the panel recommended this be a height threshold. So again, like we discussed before, the buildings could be higher than that, but that's when there'd be additional matters of consideration to look at the benefits to the city. This was a good outcomes. And 40 metres is about 10-ish stories, but of course that depends on the ceiling and building floor, the floor heights that would be used. So this might take a bit of background, so I apologise for that. But the notified plan had a method called city outcome contributions for buildings that would be over that height, the maximum height or height threshold. So that replaces the current system in our plan for what was called design excellence. So it was a point-based system. If the more points you had for things such as like low carbon buildings, high resilience buildings, assisted housing, accessible housing, those type of city benefits, you would get more points for the more of those outcomes that you gave. And so the more points you got, the higher you potentially could go as part of the assessment. So some of those matters were quantitative. So, for example, accessible housing as defined. If you provided X amount, then you get X number of points. So it was quite clear. But some of the points depended on quality. For example, public space. If you just provided a little bit out the rear and it was all shaded, you might get less points than if it was right next to a street. So submitters had varied opinions on this. Some gave qualified support, some opposed it. Various submitters and the reporting officers gave various suggestions for improvement. And so the panel spent a fair bit of time looking at what was the rationale for this, what was the objectives, how it would actually work, is it actually legal? So in the panel's recommendation, they've actually recommended to remove this particular method for city outcome contribution points and instead replace it with more statements of development outcomes and criteria to be considered in resource consents. So this means, again, that buildings that or new buildings or additions, alterations that are above that threshold or below the 6-story minimum height, and also above, this also would apply to the metropolitan and local centre zones, above those height limits, though that would be discretionary, that positive outcomes such as public space, public accessibility, reusing heritage buildings, the other things you see there, they could be considered as positive outcomes that might offset some of the adverse effects of the taller buildings. Should note that these overheight things, as I said, wouldn't apply to the mixed use zone and the new precincts. Also, other components of the city outcome contributions were added into the policy about quality development outcomes in the city centre zone and centre zone. So these are things that would apply to all buildings, regardless of whether they're over or under height. These are matters that, as part of that restricted discretionary assessment, council could consider. So things like emergency service, vehicle access, universal accessibility, reduced carbon emissions, increased climate change, etc. Now, given this quite complex, I'm sure that I would call on the chair of the panel if there's any detailed questions I'm unable to answer on that. The new mixed-use zone, Curtis Street and Adelaide Road precincts, had some quality design outcomes as well, but it's a more simplified version of what was in the city centres and centre zones there. The proposed plan had design guides to guide assessment of these buildings in the city centres and in the residential areas. This is something that Adam referred to yesterday, and so I'm going to cover them here. So the questions that the panel considered included whether to keep the design guides or not have them at all, whether they should be changed to be just non-statutory, so just guidance and for reference, or whether, on the other hand, whether they should be incorporated into the specific rules to be quite directive. The submitters also had concern about the number and repetition of the guidelines, and also the level of subjectivity. The specific guidelines had weighting in here as well, so 1, 2, or 3 points would give it more or less weighting. So for this, the panel recognised that it would be good to get the various design experts together in a room, so they directed an expert conference and then would be hearing submissions after that. So Boffa Miskell facilitated this conference, and with members from Council, Kaingaora, Mcindoe Urban, Retirement Villages and Willis Bond. And the conferencing basically agreed that, yeah, the whole design guides did need to be reviewed with significant format and content changes, that some content in heritage and subdivision could be moved into other areas and the rest removed, but that principally the design guides were a good method and should be statutory within the plan, and there were associated changes to the rule framework from that. Other recommendations including deleting the design guide introduction chapter, replacing those 1, 2, 3 dots with more of an outcomes format where the guidelines are shifted to the relevant outcome, so it's quite clear what is trying to be achieved. That there be 2 tiers of guidance. One would be what is required, and the other being what is considered based on just the application and the location and whether it's appropriate. The number of guidelines is reduced quite a bit. For residential, it's from 137 to 47. For centres and mixed use, it's from 97 to 47. As mentioned, the heritage and subdivision design guides are recommended to be deleted, and the city outcome contributions part also deleted because it was replaced with those policies that I talked about earlier. And they're just mentioning in terms of how it gets tied into those rules, that it be put in with the policies rather than doubled up in rule references. So moving on to the waterfront zone part, which again is quite separate from the city centre. The first thing I wanted to to just note is that the proposed plan didn't specifically indicate the location for the whale malai when it was notified, just given the timing of that notification versus when the council actually resolved in principle to support that application. The whale malai then didn't make a submission on the plan themselves, asking for any changes. However, they did make further submission points. Further submission can only be in support or opposition of existing submissions, and they asked for some changes which were outside the scope of those original submissions. Also, they didn't appear at the hearing. The other submitters' main topics included the extent of public open space protection, because the new plan does identify specific public open spaces for protection. The Wellington Waterfront framework, if that should be referenced or even quoted or just used as an input to the drafting as it was. Connectivity, public transport, visitor accommodation and service areas on around the ground floor, building demolition, and also the Meridian building, which you can see in the picture there. The landowners there asked for additional building height in the plan to enable redevelopment, given they have quite significant costs for redoing their foundations. So the panel's findings were supporting that the plan's approach that new buildings in this area, new public spaces should be publicly notified, should be a public process. Supported protection of the open spaces and sunlight, as with the city centre. Added 2 small public open spaces, as shown on the right there. The one above is the new Bell Gully public space, which has been built, and the other one is a public space between the steamship and Queen's Wharf buildings. Supporting public transport on the Keys to Oriental Parade. So this part actually is, so that whole area is within the waterfront zone, so recognising that, the original plan for mass rapid transit, but even now the government and regional council support for bus priority is good to be identified there, but not in other areas. The panel supported keeping new developments discretionary and non-complying. So if you remember that spectrum, that's at the more restrictive end of consents. And that the building height and scale should be kept low and similar to adjacent buildings. And that the building coverage for the whole zone be no more than 35% of the whole area, so it is more of an open space area than a built area. And supported visitor accommodation service areas on ground floors. So the last topic I'll cover here, it's almost there, was on wind. So the plan has controls or requires assessment of the effect of wind from large buildings onto streets and other public spaces. I think we've all had experience of how the wind can push us around. And some submitters were concerned about the cost and the time that it takes to do these quantitative wind assessments for quite tall buildings, where you've got a whole model and physical model, and you model the wind speeds and try to work out what happens. So when is that needed versus when would a qualitative wind assessment, so you're just getting an expert out there doing some wind measurements and using their professional judgment, whether that would work. And also, who should be notified? Like, should it be a situation where people can have their say, or is it more of a technical advice to a consent application? So the panel recommended that yes, they supported continuing with these quantitative model-based wind studies, but also for those buildings which are in tall but not, well, it says there really, so from 15 to 25 metres, and local centre, neighbourhood centre, medium high density, residential, hospital and tertiary, and for city centre, metro centre, port, waterfront, stadium, that if your building's 50 to 25 metres or 20 to 25 metres respectively, that you'd have the option to just go with that more qualitative assessment, which is more affordable but perhaps less precise. But above that, above 25 metres, you still have to get the quantitative study. The panel also noted that there could be effects of buildings and centres on adjoining residentially zoned areas, and they found that there wasn't enough technical advice or cost benefits to really them to give a recommendation on provisions for that, so they've put that back to the council to say you might want to investigate this further. Also, one other change is in the tertiary education and hospital zones that the panel recommended that the wind provisions should apply to the public spaces like your walkways and public squares within those areas, not just the streets around the outside. So I'll hand back to Sean now.
Excellent. So your next topics will be next week. Last night we published the Historic Heritage, Notable Trees, View Shafts, Sites and Areas of Significance, parts of the Independent Hearings Panel's recommendations. And then a week later you'll be considering natural hazards. After that there is Three Waters, Noise, Subdivisions and Earthworks, and then we begin to move into the consideration, the questions and answers that come from the plan as a whole. With the natural hazards briefing, I'll also be providing you with the advice that's been asked for on the how amendmenting works and how the recommendations flow into the plan. And with that, do we have any questions?
So I'm taking a couple of lists, questions for officers and questions for commissioners, but for officers in particular, was yours, yeah, I'll start with Councillor Beneda. Can others put their hands up? Chung.
And actually, could I hop on the other list as well?
Yep.
So my question on the briefing was just a small one. Can you remind me of our intent to produce a Te Ngākau Civic Precinct Master Plan? Were we doing that or are we not doing that now?
So your intent to produce a Civic Square Te Ngākau Master Plan was not a district planning matter, it was a general council planning matter. So that's not reflected within the district plan.
That's sort of my question, because my question is, if we are doing it, do these recommendations have any impact on the shape of that master plan if one exists?
I would have to come back to you on that. I'd have to have a look at the master plan.
Cool, thanks very much.
Councillor Chung.
Great, thank you. I'm not sure whether these questions will actually be going to the commissioners or to officers. I'm just going over some of the things that we've talked about here. One of the items was car parking was permitted at ground level, but only at the rear of the buildings. Now, wouldn't this be counterproductive to actually cutting down on the space? Because for the cars to actually get to the rear of the building, wouldn't a driveway have to be put in there, whereas they may not need that? Or are you just referring to underground car parking?
Yeah, that's correct. So there are standards in the transport chapter as well about access to sites, including in the city centre zone. But assuming those were met, so that there'd be sufficient space for both the frontage and entrance for the vehicle, it's recognising on large sites that some car parking at the rear within a building is still efficient use of the site, because that was the main driver for why there shouldn't be on ground floor parking, is to avoid that.
I see. Okay, thanks. Now, another thing, PDP, I can't remember what that stands for, replaces design excellence. Now, would these new rules be more prescriptive than design excellence? Because from experience, I found that design excellence can mean it has a broad range of interpretation. And I'll give you one example, that in the building in 111 Dixon Street, they were permitted to actually exceed the height limits allowed for there when they gave part of the street, part of the land to the council. They donated that to the council for access in perpetuity. So would something like that be permitted under the new regulations?
So with the panel recommendations for positive outcomes, I think it's fair to categorise it as it's perhaps broader. So design is still a component of it in terms of particularly for landmark buildings and the effect on the cityscape. But other matters are added. For example, about if there's adjacent sites or areas of heritage, if heritage buildings are being preserved as part of it, or if there's new public accessibility or new public space provided. And so there's, and also accessible affordable housing. So those matters are added to the list of considerations, if that answers the question.
So does that, going back to my original question for that, does this make it more prescriptive so that they have to actually comply with one of those, whereas under design excellence, it's actually quite a broad range of things, and so what's happened, I find in the past, is that the developer will say, okay, this is what I need, what would you like from me to the council to actually achieve this, and then the council, and then there's a bit of negotiation there. So would this be permissible still?
So my reading of what the panel have recommended is that it wouldn't be more prescriptive in a rule sense. So it wouldn't. So these matters aren't rules saying you must achieve this, this, and this, but more that as part of the overall assessment of the application, if a development is producing positive outcomes, and that's kind of weighed alongside the other effects that the building may have.
Yep, great, thank you. Next question on the Meridian building. You mentioned that they've actually applied for increasing the height limits around there. Have they actually started that building yet?
They haven't applied for resource consent to build a building. What they have done is submitted to, on the district plan, asking for a higher height limit should they wish to build a building in the future.
Oh, great, okay, thank you.
One more question, Councillor.
Yep, okay. You didn't comment on residential accommodation on the waterfront. Is this something that came within the bailiwick of your panel?
Yes, there was a discussion about whether residential should be allowed at ground level along with visitor accommodation, and I might just quickly check that. And
yep. Okay.
get
Great.
back to you on that one.
No hurry. Thank you. Thank you.
Councillor Randall.
Yes, I'm just struggling with all these reports. You issuing us about 700 pages of reports today didn't really help. But just in terms of guidance for myself and other councillors and possibly the public, can you just confirm that this which report this briefing is connected to? I mean, is it like 3A, or is like these numbers like 3A, 2B, and all these sort of things? Because behind the scenes, and you probably did say that, but it's just a little bit confusing as to. I see what you mean. Oh, so they're in 4A and 4B. Okay. So that's what that means in terms of those bit in the brackets. That's actually quite important. Yep. I might suggest you do a summary document on our diligent report so that we can translate the topic to the report number. First of all, simple stuff. 22 metres is 6 stories, which is under the wind thing. You said the range of 20 to 25 metres can have a qualitative wind effect. So that's sort of up to 6-storey-ish sort of buildings. They don't have to do a quantitative or a modelled effect. Is that correct? That's where the rule is.
Yes, so they've got that slide there as well. So it does depend on the zone. If you're in the city centre, metro centre, port, waterfront or stadium, the option for a qualitative study is for any buildings with a maximum height of 20 to 25 metres. Above 25 metres, you're required to provide the quantitative assessment. And for the other zones listed there, for like local centres, neighbourhood centre, medium high density res, it's any buildings 15 to 25 metres. So that is a change. That is a change that the panel is recommending from the notified plan, where they're bringing in the medium and high residential zones, because the panel considered that if they're going to be tall buildings enabled in some of these locations, that if they have wind effects on public spaces, that should be considered as well.
Okay, and also under. I thought it was an early one. Oh, the Basin Reserve zone is a maximum height of 42.5 metres, but again, what's that in stories? Because is that like, it's like about 12 or 12 stories roughly, or something like that. And that's where we had this conversation yesterday.
So Andrew has diligently pre-worked them out.
Yes, it's around, I think we saw it was about 13 to 14 stories.
Okay.
It could be a little bit more, a little bit less, because again, they really do depend on whether it's commercial or residential. It starts to fluctuate.
I understand. It's trying to get a very broad feel for the sort of height, which is the maximum, because obviously, 13, 14 stories is still quite a lot of building. Thank you. You talked about bus priority along the enablement along the waterfront zone. What is the actual understanding about where that's at? Because we're doing a long-term plan. I don't see any money for bus priority.
So this is connected to a sort of a strange way the district plan works. So think of it as a receiving environment. So whereas with the long-term plan you push things forward, with the district plan you catch things. And so what we're doing and what has been recommended there is that a catch has been put in place ready for if there is bus priority there. It does not predetermine the council's or any other authority's ability to build it.
Okay. And lastly, in the COC, what they call it, the City Outcomes Contribution, there was permission to go over height if the building was built to the design guide, was compliant with the design guide. Is that still part of the proposed district plan, or is that being taken out as part of removal of the city, of commissioners recommending the removal of the City Outcomes Contribution?
The design guide has been added in with the policies that would apply to all significant buildings. So it would be applied regardless of the over-under height situation.
Sure, I know, but just in terms of my understanding of where the City Outcomes Contribution permission to go over height, over the maximum threshold, you gave percentages. It means you could go high if you did good things, as you outlined. One of the things that it said was that you could go over height if you complied with the design guide, if I understand that correctly. And in terms of where I read that as, and I just want to confirm that that element is in or not in. And perhaps this is a question for commissioners because they're probably, but we're talking about the City Outcomes Contribution, and I just want to understand whether that's still an element. So if you comply with the design guide, you still are limited to the height restrictions, or do you get extra bonus points to go higher?
Through my understanding of the panel's recommendations, that the design guide element occurs irrespective of the height threshold. So the going over the height threshold just adds additional matters of discretion that the council can add, and also note that there's an opportunity potentially for the council to notify the application as well. So the design guide isn't dependent on going over height.
Okay. And lastly, with the city,
Yeah, great. Keep going, sorry.
I can go back on the list. If you
Oh, no. I was going to say final question, but then you said my last question, so that's great.
My final question. In terms of the City Outcomes Contribution, having read some of the reports, I note that there was some element of the recommendations of commissioners around the legality of it. Can you just sort of summarise for us that the potential issue that they sort of explored?
Councillor, I could attempt, but I'm afraid I wouldn't do as good a job as perhaps Robert could do. So I might defer that to him if that's all right.
Councillor McNulty.
Yeah, just a quick question. This concept of thresholding, so there's height limits, but then we can go above them. Do you see that as being a more or less prescriptive manner for building than that the current regime has in place?
I would see it as it's more enabling in terms of the phrasing. As soon as you start talking about height limits, then the justification to go above that tends to be a lot stronger. There has to be a lot stronger. Whereas if the policy only talks about threshold, and beyond this threshold you incorporate these other considerations, which are often quite positive considerations, then on balance, this system is more enabling for quite tall buildings in the city centre zone.
Cool. Thank you.
I would also note from a consenting point of view, it does make it clearer for both applicants and consent officers as to how their two tools work.
And Councillor Pennant.
Thank you again. And sorry, it has been a busy time. Can you let me know if wind and climate change were looked at in terms of the building heights?
You mean to, so I can understand, you're asking about the long-term climate effects
For
on...
increased wind, yeah.
Okay.
I don't believe so.
I can ask
Robert
later.
can perhaps
I can
confirm if that's correct, but I don't recall that being raised.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, the Heritage Design Guide, can you just go over why that was suggested for deletion?
So with respect, I'll hand that question over
Okay,
to
that's
our
totally
chairs.
fine. The point system for better outcomes, is there actually any evidence that that works to give you the outcomes you want?
Perhaps this is something that the panel may explain their reasoning for, because again, they have decided not to go with a point system, but instead to follow more of a policy-based system, which the current plan is using a variant of that.
Your Worship, perhaps I could suggest we bring the commissioners to the table
And just go with it?
Yes.
Okay, so
Well-
then can I be put on that list?
Why don't you just keep going?
Okay,
And then
thanks.
I'll...
Should we,
Yeah.
well, I guess, yeah, probably they are for the commissioners, because I want to... Well, actually, can I just clarify around sunlight? As you know, it's a big preoccupation of mine. Whether this sort of recommendations will make it greater for people living in the central city or worse?
Again, not to just say what Robert might want to say, but my reading is that it has become clearer in terms of where the standards apply and over what time period you're measuring it. So what time periods of the day?
Can I ask you, Robert? Thank you. Yeah, look, I'm really concerned that people have a good quality of life. I just wondered if you could just talk a little bit about your approach to that and how much sunlight access people need and what the evidential basis was for looking at that issue.
It's a broad question because it relates to quite a number of different aspects of the centre zones, but you can be assured that we did look at it quite carefully. It was raised by a few, particularly in reference to trying to reduce the standards that apply to buildings like outdoor decks and things like that. So the issue of getting access to sunlight was quite a critical consideration, for example, in that situation. Also in terms of public parks as well, protecting sunlight to the key public areas of the city, things like that.
And did you keep the sunlight protections for Aro Park and Carrera?
So we didn't remove any.
Okay, that's... wind and climate change and the height of buildings, did you look at that or was there just no evidence around that?
From my memory, there was quite a bit of technical evidence around the wind. It was all around wind speed and safety from wind, effects of buildings on people below. So to that degree, wouldn't have taken climate change into account. But if climate change is, say, increasing the amount of wind in the situation, then the experts that deal in this would know that and factor that into the
into the assessment, so they'll be able to do that. Okay, that's good. Yeah, the arguments around the point system versus a more policy-based one, yeah, just could you talk a little bit about that? Because we really want some of those outcomes. You know, I raised the question a couple of days ago about the affordable housing provisions, so these need to work.
Yes, well, the city outcomes contributions really did attest our thinking. It is quite innovative. Can't even say it. The examples we were given elsewhere were quite different to it. They were like floor-based things, you know, extra height for this amount of floor space and things like that. So it's quite new, and we looked into the reasons for it, the background, what it was trying to achieve in terms of outcomes, and then we looked at it in terms of its legality, as Mr. Wharton said. We were assured that it is legal, but the tests around reasonableness, effectiveness, efficiency, all those good, you know, Section 32 tests were front and foremind to us. So then we looked at it as a mechanism. And one of the key concerns we had was the point system sounds like it's quantitative kind of measurable thing, but it wasn't really. There was a lot of discretion inbuilt into allocating points. You could get a certain point of 1 to 10, but who decided that and how and things was still fairly open-ended. Council officers did try and improve that aspect of it, but not really to our satisfaction in the end. It's still a very discretionary-based system. That was a major problem that we had with it. So then we turned our mind to, well, if that's not going to work, what would work more effectively? And we did return, as Mr. Walton said, to the policy approach. So we've got this two-tiered height system going on, particularly with the city centre zone. There's no absolute height limit for the city centre zone. As tall as ever. There's a threshold. So if you're below that threshold, all buildings require restricted discretionary consent to go through that quality design process that happens now anyway. But if you're going to go over that height threshold, then some extra considerations, as Mr. Walton said, can't kick in through this policy, which is a revised city outcomes policy, that look at what other outcomes is this building going to achieve for the city development outcomes, public space, accessibility, all those things, as well as affordable housing is one of those matters as well. So if they offer affordable housing, that's a good outcome that gets measured along with the thing.
Thank you. Last question, just around the design guides, that you had some concerns about them. My particular interest is in the heritage. Can you just talk about, I guess, whether you felt that we had done enough in this area and heritage, with a particular emphasis on heritage?
Yes, that's the subject of the reports that were released last night and were scheduled for next week. But I'll give you a preemptive strike. The answer, in essence, was no. We didn't think the Heritage Design Guide added value. There was too much generic material that wasn't heritage related. All the heritage stuff was at the lower end of the document about guidance rather than they weren't heritage outcomes. So what you will find when you get to the report 3A, there's a section, and in essence we accepted Goangora's argument that it didn't add value. But we did recommend that the council do more work and produce something that would be of greater assistance to people working on heritage buildings.
Councillor Matthews.
Thank you. So my questions are for the panellists, and I want to go back to the evidence presented by Dr. Helm, given its significance in various recommendations. And I would first, I've got about 4, I think. Firstly, does the panel consider it appropriate for expert witnesses to describe their own blog posts as published evidence?
I think I wasn't aware of any witness actually doing that. I think that experts cite their own papers all the time. The value of those papers depends on whether they've been peer reviewed, or whether they're just the expert's own opinion. Like you can get a system of, sort of internal reinforcement, so you're not actually adding. But in terms of Dr. Helm's evidence, we were listening to what he was telling us, his reasoning as he was explaining it to us. I can't recall us having regard to anything he had written in the background.
So given that the reference cited was a blog post which was not peer reviewed, did the panel assess the quality of that blog post or any information related to it cited in Dr. Helm's submission? It appears to be the only critique of the Auckland upzoning research. And is the panel aware of the critique, some would say debunking, of that blog post, which somewhat strangely was not cited in Dr. Helm's submission?
I go back to my previous answer. I wasn't aware if Dr. Helm cited a blog post. I can't recall him doing that, and I certainly can't recall reading it. In fact, I'm pretty sure I didn't read it. He did comment on the analysis of upzoning in Auckland. That was drawn to our attention by the representative of Generation 02. He did that first. And the representative of MHUD, the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, referred to those economic analyses. Dr. Helm's comment was that the jury was out on whether it was a case of correlation or causation. We noted that. We didn't make any finding on that because essentially whatever may or may not have happened in Auckland, we didn't have any evidence before us of what had happened, why it had happened, the extent to which it was relevant to the Wellington situation. The upzoning they were talking about was in 2016, so the issue is, even if it had been correctly analysed, is that applicable to Wellington? I think we just saw it as a red herring.
I am very confused by this answer because Dr. Helm's evidence around the impact of upzoning in Auckland relating to zoning not having and supply not having an impact on affordability was emphasised in your report and recommendations. So I find this answer perplexing. However, I want to ask, is it possible that an organisation such as a residents' association seeking to limit housing in their area would seek expert witness that was out of step with almost an entire profession's view on supply and demand because it supported their viewpoint? And if so, should the panel have applied more scrutiny to the evidence they were presented with?
With respect, I don't think that's a point of clarification. I think that's but I'll endeavour to answer your point nonetheless. We have had to make a decision based on the evidence before us. We did not have evidence of what is the prevailing economic view. We had competing economic evidence, and we had to make a judgment as to which economic evidence we thought was better founded. That in terms of your question about Dr. Helm being out of step, that in my mind it's not a numbers game, it's who has the best analysis.
Can I clarify how the panel established what economic evidence was provided to it had more weighting if they didn't read the cited analysis?
The evidence we relied on from Dr. Helm was an explanation of what he suggested were facts that contradicted the alternative economic analysis that Mr. Cullen had put to us. That we tested that by asking the witnesses questions. So, for instance, I asked Dr. Helm specifically, I put to him that a number of witnesses had said to us that out of further enabled supply, affordability would follow. And said to him, "Are you telling us that that's not the case?" And he said, "Yes." And then he explained to us why that was. And his answer appeared credible to us. By the same token, I put the contrary propositions to Mr. Cullen, and his answers appeared less credible to us, and so balancing those that evidence, we gave more weight to Dr. Helm's opinion. It's fair to say that we did not study the tomes that have been written by economists of trying to analyse this, because, for instance, the representative of MHUD referred to the analysis you were talking about in a single line in a footnote. And as an example, that it's undoubtedly true that we did not, I did not, I can't speak to my colleagues, I haven't asked them, but I did not read every footnoted reference that was put to us if the witness did not say that this was important to their analysis. It was framed as something for us to note on the way by, and we took it on board from that perspective.
Possibly these two are for officers. And so I'm just having to go back in my mind to the slides, just noting the Whale Malai had missed this process. Will that propose any challenges for them to continue with the proposed development on the waterfront?
My understanding, Councillor, is that the Trust is investigating a resource consent for that, for the Whale Malai. And so they, as an applicant, will need to make a decision about whether to apply under the operative plan as of now, or the new waterfront provisions once they take effect on council decisions here. The provisions will be slightly different, so that'll be a decision for them to make.
Okay. Just another one, and I cannot remember whether these were in the design guides, but the requirement around permeable surfaces, were they retained in the design guides or in the recommendations?
I believe they are, yes.
Yeah, I believe so too.
Memory,
Yeah, we will confirm with you in writing.
Yeah, that would be good. Thank you.
What I do recall is we had a recommendation that some of the material related to permeability be shifted out of the zones, particularly out of the residential zones, and into the Three Waters chapter, which is Robert's baby.
For the people at home, the commissioners have answered that there was a proposal to move the rules out of the design guides into the zones. So again, we'll confirm in writing.
Great, and so this one for the commissioners. So yesterday we were talking, I was asking about the emissions, and you responded that there was no evidence given about urban sprawl. So I just want to check, were you given the Te Atakura document that refers to urban form and emissions and the way we're trying to redesign our city when you were, making your recommendations? So the Te Atakura document?
It's the Council's climate change strategy.
It was certainly referred to us.
Sorry, Commissioners, could we just get you to speak more directly into the microphone, please?
Sorry. We were certainly told that it existed. I cannot recall if it was actually tabled as by any witness. So I can't answer that. That in terms of, I think that the issue was not. I don't think it was about urban sprawl, but about it was all more about that was in contention. It was more about the relative carbon emissions of inner city development versus development further out within the city. It's not the Auckland scenario of urban development disappearing out over the horizon. But it was more in that context than about urban sprawl. But as I say, that's my recollection.
Just through you, Mayor, the council has extensively used Te Atakura in the preparation of the draft plan. So there are a number of provisions that the panel have considered, which come from or have been guided by that document.
Okay. So then maybe just to go on, if the commissioners felt that there was a gap in information on how emissions were evolving in cities, was there a way, was it possible that the commissioners could have asked for more evidence that is readily available, like the IPCC report, which does talk about living more condensed in the cities?
I think can I just say that we clearly had evidence pointing to the positive trends that living more compactly had in terms of climate change. What we didn't have was quantifying it in CO tonnes equivalent, and so as to give us any quantification. But in terms of the thrust of your question, could we have asked for more evidence? At that point, I'd talk about the tyranny of the timetable we were under. That because we had this hard deadline to complete the process, the potential in practice to send something off for a further inquiry and a report back was very limited. Like the design guides were an exception, and that was able to be shoehorned into the time frame we were working under as a result of a huge amount of effort from the council and the parties who were participating in that process to meet that time frame. So we were very aware that, right or wrong, we were stuck with what we had, and that the opportunity augment that because of the time constraints we were working under was very limited.
Thank you.
Councillor Wineta.
Kia ora team, thank you for coming in today. I've got three kind of lines of inquiry that I want to look at. That is an excellent tie, by the way. Pardon? Thank you. I'll proceed with my questions as I was going to, Councillor Pannett. So my first question is, did you feel that a regionally consistent approach was important when you were producing your recommendations?
To the extent we understood what was happening through the region, and at this point, I'd draw your attention to the fact that we had within the panel membership participation. So I chaired the Pairua panel. One of my Wellington colleagues was on that panel also. He was also on the Hutt City panel. Another colleague was on the Upper Hutt panel.
Gosh.
So we didn't have that kind of evidence before, but we had an understanding through those connections of what the other greater urban Wellington
Got it. So a lot of cross-pollination happening.
There was, and we had to be careful because one of the things is that we couldn't rely on evidence, for instance, that I had heard in Pairua and say, well, because of that, we could reach a decision in Wellington, because that has to be kept separate. But in my case, I was able to use that knowledge as because Pairua was in front of Wellington in timescale as an information base. So, for instance, in the Pairua process, I'd heard all of the same Kaingaora witnesses who gave evidence in the Wellington hearing. So I was very familiar with Mr. Cullen's views, for instance.
Got it. Okay, I understand. So, given that there was expertise on the panel that had experienced all these other things, granted they can't take previous data into account, but were the decisions made by the panel around the Johnsonville line unanimous?
Yes.
Interesting. So, even given that some of those commissioners worked on other plans where they designated, for example, the Melling line, which has the exact same frequency as the Johnsonville line, as mass rapid, what's the discrepancy there?
Because in the NPSUD has these tests for rapid transit, and it says existing or planned, and planned is defined as per the RLTP, the Regional Land and Transport Plan, and the Regional Land Transport Plan has plans for greater frequency on the Melling line, whereas there are no plans for greater frequency on the Johnsonville line.
I see.
And that's a point we made in our report. That's the distinction.
I see. And
Final question, Councillor.
Okay. I might hop back on the list in that case.
Councillor Randall. And we're going to limit it to 3 again, just so we're getting a good cycle, so FYI.
Thank you.
Oh, and questions of clarification, please.
So thank you, Your Worship. So first of all, I just want to probe a little bit around the hearing process and what you sort of alluded to, amount of things to go through. So I wonder if you could briefly explain, because these things are done in streams, this it could be from officers or from commissioners. What exactly happens when you go and do a stream of evidence, say, around the city zone, for example? What are the different stages that the submitters, the officers, submitters, and the commissioners have actually go through with that?
So the hearing panels comprised 8 members. That was to give some ability to hear them within that truncated timetable, so that at the minimum you had 4 to hear a particular stream of evidence, and there was a lot of crossover between panel members, so that was the case. The chair's role was to just provide that level of consistency and oversight in the decision making, not actually necessarily be part of the deliberations, but just make sure there's some consistency between the sort of thinking. Design guides would be a classic one because it cuts across a number of streams. So that when we came to deliberate, we could sort of draw on some of the panel members' knowledge of what happened and what was heard in other ones if it was relevant to that particular stream.
So I was just more thinking of the steps, saying like there's an officer's report, then there's submitters, and then
like I could go through it. So starting point, we have the Section 42A report, detailed report examining all of the submissions on a particular subject matter. We then had submitters evidence, expert evidence, and this is the sequence there. So those are the first 2. Third, we had a provision for rebuttal. While it was open for submitters to file rebuttal evidence, I think in practice almost universally the only rebuttal was from the council. Rebuttal is responding to the submitter's expert evidence. Following the rebuttal, we had an opportunity for like legal submissions and lay presentations were filed in advance. We discussed that yesterday. Then we rolled into the hearing, and the rules of engagement said that parties were able to file a short summary, like a witness was able to file a short summary of their evidence, which in practice they used to rebut the rebuttal. And then we asked them questions on anything and everything we could think of that was relevant to the matters before us. And through that process, it's a progressive iteration. So while I said the council rebuttal, in many cases the council's rebuttal was the witness has a good point and we accept it. That was one response. Another one, the witness has a good point, but I don't agree with their relief entirely, and I suggest, but I agree that my initial recommendation needs to shift, and I have moved to this position, or I think it's rubbish, and here are the 15 reasons why.
So moving on to my questions I put to officers, and maybe you could answer. With respect to the city outcomes contribution, there was some element of the issue around legality about that, which was a concern for commissioners. Can you just briefly explain what commissioners wanted to explore and how much that's actually, the legality of it is actually part of the issue about deciding not to recommend it?
The reasons why we sought that legal advice it was outlined in the report, but in brief, as I said, it was a very new mechanism, not found elsewhere in New Zealand or in the overseas examples that we got given. And it did rely, as I said, on a level of discretion, but purported to be sort of a measurable, scientific almost way of doing it. So we were just testing how legally valid it was as a mechanism, and the advice was, yes, it is legally valid, and we got that from two sources, not just one. And then the tests for us were then around it as a mechanism, an RMA mechanism, how effective that would be, how efficient, et cetera, and how appropriate.
Okay. And last question, under the city, and I read this myself before I became a councillor, but under the city outcomes, the proposed city outcomes contribution, there's a sort of a statement that says it kicks in from 25% above the maximum threshold. And has a statement that says that developments below, and this is from officers' recommended proposals for it, developments below 25% of, so developments below going above 25% height, there's developments that are over height, but between 1% and 25%, do not need to meet the city outcomes contribution, but they do need to satisfy the relevant guidelines in this design guide. So I just wanted to clarify what's the Commission's recommendation about if a building meets the design guideline, can they just go over height as of right, or is that just does the height limits in, say, the metropolitan centre zone or the high density residential zone, does that actually read more hard and fast, and after that you go to a different phase of assessment? In other words, that's sort of been rejected because that was sort of part of the thing that was baked into the city outcomes contribution element of the proposed district plan.
That 25% has been rejected, but the basic process is that the design guides apply to whether you're below or above the height limit or threshold, whether you're 25% or 50%. There are elements in the design guides, particularly for the commercial and mixed-use areas, that address the height of the building, you know, the highest part and how it relates to context and the city environment. And that applies whatever. the height. So it would depend on context, where the building is, how prominent it is, and that sort of thing.
But that part, insofar as it's put into the city outcomes, that's also gone as well. And the city outcomes has really been put aside as recommended.
No, there are elements in the policy around overheight buildings that look at particularly its effect on the city environment and the form and shape of the cityscape, if you like.
Councillor McNulty.
Kudo, I'd like to dive back into the Willis Bond submission from yesterday. So I think the characterisation that you had was they said there's plenty of developable land and it's cost and onset yields that are the problem. Is that a fair summation?
Yes.
And that characterisation was used as a piece of evidence for your decisions across the city, including the number of housing units to be enabled?
I think it was part of the equation.
Part of the equation. Okay, so I just want to clarify if you stand by that characterisation, because when Willis Bond presented to you, they were speaking of commercial developments in the central city zone only. So they were talking about Willis Street, Victoria Street and Courtney Place. When they made mention of insufficient yields, it was in the context of those streets versus development on the waterfront, and I directly quote, the high quality market. And if you look at the final report, no mention of Willis Bond is there that they actually were, quote, very supportive of the proposed district plan, but the remarks around them, that initial characterisation did stack up into the final report. So do you think that was an appropriate characterisation of their submission to the panel?
No, I don't believe so, because when Mr. McGuinness talked to us, he also talked to us about, he made a comment that it was pointless zoning for hill suburbs for high development, for high density development, because developers like him would always choose flat site. Because and so I took from that, because the city centre zone is obviously not on a hill suburb, that he was not limiting himself to the city centre. Now, as I say, that was my reading of his evidence. It was a and so I was comfortable with that. But as I say, I emphasise that while we've referred to it frequently, I think it was an example of what I would characterise as a private developer telling us that private developers are acutely aware and focused on what profit they're going to make out of their investment. And I didn't find that very surprising at all.
Final question, Councillor.
No, look, I'll go back for another round, please.
Councillor Chung.
Great, thank you. I only have two questions, so I'll be able to be quicker. At the beginning of the presentation that you had before, you talked about one of the things that you're looking at was the minimum size of properties. Now, was that regarding residential or commercial or both? And what conclusions did you actually have on that?
In my presentation, I was referring to the request to reduce the minimum apartment sizes, and also about provision of outdoor space and whether that should be reduced or removed altogether. So the panel may want to consider or give their thoughts on that.
You first.
Yeah, we looked at that quite carefully. In fact, we undertook a site visit to a brand new apartment hotel to look at the site size, so we can get a measure of that, because it's very hard sitting around here sort of thinking what 30 square metres looks like versus 35 and all that side. So that was helpful to our consideration, and basically we went and agreed with the reporting officer's recommendations around unit sizes, minimum sizes.
And similarly, in the residential zone hearing, Dr. Zamani gave quite strong evidence that it was really important to retain minimum unit size. The way he put it, as I recall it, was sort of, if you're going to push much greater densities, you have to make sure it's done well. And that was his essential thesis for supporting but he also gave us material on international standards, particularly in Europe, and it was looking at those standards. It was evident, as one of our number who trained in Europe pointed out, that the only countries with lower unit sizes that were being proposed were hot weather countries where people spend a lot of time outside, like Spain and Portugal.
Yes, thank you. So
Councillor, you said 2 questions.
So what? Sorry.
You said 2 questions.
Yes, I
one more.
Yep. So, okay, can I come back? Oh, no, I'll ask this one now, and I'll save the other one for next round. So, on these minimum sizes, was there any recommendation on whether our current minimum size was actually too large or too small, or the same?
In terms of the centre zones, for sort of apartment units and things, yes, we had submitters wanting to reduce unit sizes, the minimum sizes. I don't recall the opposite occurring. So we had a decision to make whether to reduce the minimum size in line with submissions or retain it as notified.
And we had the same in the residential zones. I'm sure that there were submitters pitching for smaller unit size in the residential zones.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Okay, so we've got 8 people left on our question list. 3 questions max, and don't be sneaky and try sneak in a follow-up question, because I might cut you off. So please keep them nice, short, concise, snappy. Councillor Free.
Just a question about the process again. I picked up when you were answering Councillor Randall that if you didn't engage early in this process, you didn't really have a chance to come in subsequently. So I guess going back to Kilbirnie, what mechanism would there have been for Kilbirnie people to have entered this process if they hadn't realised it was going to be a radical change?
If they hadn't lodged a submission or further submission, none.
None at all.
Well, they would have to find a submitter that they could piggyback on effectively.
Okay, thank you. The other question goes back to sunlight and maybe it reflects a little. You mentioned that you did have quite a lot of submissions around sunlight. Can you just clarify what changes you did decide to recommend? You have talked about heights in Moore Street and some adjustments to the boundary but did you make any other adjustments? Because I can remember things like light wells outside windows and was there anything that you decided to change as a result of people's submission around sunlight?
One important fact, I talked about outdoor decks and things before, and we recommended retaining the notified version of minimum outdoor decks and things for sunlight, because it was put to us that some buildings face south and won't get that, and we considered, well, if they want to dispense with that, then they have to go through the consent process and justify why. The other important aspect was around building setbacks from each other, particularly neighbouring buildings, and we did, through sort of questions through the hearing process, get some recommended revisions to the bulk and location setbacks, and part of that was to ensure that the living areas of particularly apartment buildings would receive a reasonable amount of daylight/sunlight, a minimum amount. Yeah.
So did you actually recommend in the end more than the officers brought to you?
We supported the officers' recommendations.
Okay.
And just for clarity, do you want me to tell you about what we did in the residential zones?
I don't know if we've got time. Maybe off. Oh, okay, all right. Colleagues would love to hear.
We recommended additional policies, particularly around for developments around open space. We heard particularly from the Newtown residents concerned about apartment blocks around Carrara Park. We felt that we didn't have any evidence or insufficient evidence to undertake the statutory evaluation that would enable us to, for instance, impose lower height limits. But what we did was to recommend additional policy consideration for those developments that needed consent and were subject to the policy regime. And so, for instance, the urban design expert from Kaingaroa said he was perfectly happy with that concept, that he accepted that there was an issue of high residential dwellings shading public parks, and that was the way we recommended it be addressed, because we thought that was as far as the evidence we had would take us.
Thank you.
Councillor Matthews.
So I want to come back to just one question, leave time for others, on Dr. Helm's evidence, where because he made a claim that the operative district plan has an abundance of development capacity and therefore the planning rules were not the problem. And I'm just wanting to clarify, how did the panel reconcile that with the cited evidence, the 2021 Housing and Business Assessment, which identified that we had an existing housing shortfall of over 10,000 units?
I don't think we did. I think we focused on we noted his statement, but we focused on on the evidence we had of what the PDP was enabling, which was 50,000 realisable dwelling units compared to a predicted 30-year demand of 31,000 and change.
Councillor Wineta.
G'day again. So I'd now like to talk about this idea of development being out of keeping with its surroundings. So the recommendations state that the risk of development, quote, out of keeping with an area that it's in is, quote, a risk that we need to take into account, despite the NPSUD Policy 6 explicitly prohibiting that from being taken into account. How do you reconcile that?
That's not what Policy 6 says. That's how I reconcile it. What Policy 6 says is that you cannot assume that there is an amenity effect. Change is not necessarily bad. It also directs that you must consider and take into account positive amenity effects along with adverse amenity effects. But it doesn't say that amenity effects are no longer relevant. And in fact, in the report we commented that if it had said that, it would probably be illegal, because Section 7 directs that maintenance and enhancement of amenity values is something that must be given particular regard. So it puts a spin on that, but it doesn't say it's irrelevant.
Okay, so if that is the case, then how can there be an accompanying document to the NPSUD which is intended for local authorities, which says that Objective 6 Charlie recognises local authorities cannot predict the location or timing of all possible opportunities for urban development? So we're talking about something that's out of keeping here. And it therefore directs local authorities to be responsive to significant development opportunities when they are proposed, because that sounds a lot to me like...
Well,
you see what I'm getting at here?
Can I seek clarification? Is that in an MFE guideline?
That is a document that is produced as an accompaniment for the NPSUD, which is intended to be an explainer for local authorities.
One of the things that we went to some care in saying is that there are now a series of Environment Court decisions saying that it is entirely inappropriate to have regard to MFE guidelines purporting to alter what national policy statements say, and in some cases in ringing tones. So we put little weight on MFE guidelines for that reason, because we've got these clear messages from the Environment Court.
Can I just add too? Practice has been, in terms of interpreting that, is that it means responsive to opportunities that the district plan may not have envisaged at the time it was formulated. So it might be a private plan change for a new development or rezoning of an area, might be for a resource consent as well, for something that's out of keeping with this district plan. So that there's a directive there not to be bound hard by the district plan as it was formulated, but to, if opportunities come along, to be responsive to those.
Okay, I understand that point of view. It seems, though, that in this very same document does say that, it gives examples of these proposed developments, and it explicitly calls things, out of sequence or unanticipated in existing plans and other strategies, or locations outside of areas identified for urban development. So it really seems like these principles, to me, are stating that out of keeping developments would be totally within scope for consideration and not a risk that can be taken into account.
If I could go first, and then Robert may have something to add. There is a specific MPS policy about not being bound or being responsive to out-of-sequence development. And I think that goes to like urban growth planning. Somebody comes in from left field with a good idea that's not on the council's in its urban growth strategy, then the NPSUD say you cannot dismiss that out of hand. You have to give it serious consideration. I haven't ever interpreted it as on an individual building out of sequence in that sense, and so. But it's certainly being responsive, as a not dismissing it out of hand, but considering it carefully.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Thank you. So this question is regarding the walking catchments from Newtown to the city. And the commissioners have said there's little amenity and pleasantness on Adelaide Road. So I just want to clarify if it was considered that once developed there would be cafes, retail, trees, parks, co-housing, and the strip would be pleasant and have lots of amenity. So was that considered?
The walking catchment element, my recollection was that we emphasised, we took on board Ms. Watson's evidence, and it wasn't about the amenity in Adelaide Road, it was the facilities. And clearly, you're right, that those facilities may improve, but it becomes a chicken and egg situation. Now, at the point when the facilities have improved, then you might look again at the walkable catchment out from those facilities. But the issue is what comes first, and so as I say, chicken and egg. But Robert?
Yeah, some of the criteria we considered in around walkability and walkable catchments was that level of amenity, and we did give regard to whether there will be future amenity on certain routes, but it had to be a certain level of certainty around that occurring, not just a possibility of it occurring. So that sort of took into account that sort of consideration for Adelaide Road.
Councillor Pennant.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, in your expert evidence, whether you got any feedback from developers about the cost due to the fact that the city is highly earthquake prone?
I can answer that. Yes, we did. In a number of respects. One of them critically was the height issue, and we were informed by several about the height as an issue in terms of cost. When it comes to the higher you go, the more cost you're going to have to put into it in terms of the structural engineering for it. And the sweet spot, if I can say, at the moment for a lot of developers is 12, 13, 14 stories max. Because beyond that, the cost of structural engineering just gets very high. And as Commissioner says, the profits get low. So that's the evidence that we got given to us.
And what about at lower levels?
I'm not sure. The evidence was mainly around the height issue, and the higher you go, it wasn't really the lower. I suppose we could infer that the lower you go, the lower the cost, but that wasn't evidence put to us.
Just a last question: did you get any evidence about well-being and people's access to sunlight, green space, that sort of thing?
Yes, it was more through officers' response to trying to lower the minimums for buildings, and the need for people to have sunlight access and open space access. So it was more in response to submitters wanting to reduce those standards that we heard evidence from.
But one of the problems we had, certainly in the residential sphere, is we had submitters expressing concern but not giving us the material that would satisfy the statutory evaluation to reduce height limits, and reporting officers weren't reporting that. They were saying that the evidence on which the council had proposed the height limits was that it was a reasonable balance. So we didn't have the material to take it further, except in the specific example that I gave you of shading of open spaces.
Councillor Randall.
Yes, I think, so I just want to explore a little bit about the fact that you're perhaps recommending a little bit less high-density residential Thank you, Councillor Free. You can go on the list. So just recommending less. I just wanted to comment. Comment. Get your feedback on maybe the reason why the fact that, for example, the Johnsonville line is not deemed a rapid transit, why you then down scaled the high density zones around the stations as was proposed. And just really, you commented on density done well, but what's the sort of counterfactual in the sense of saying what was your concern if you just zoned an area to be high density without having the supporting facilities and transport links that were outlined in NSPUD?
That goes back to the general point that we covered in Report 1A. Sort of, is there a need? Is there a case for widespread increases in density other than as required by the NPSUD? And we thought there wasn't, that there was heaps of capacity, as it was, as I said, 50,000 versus 51 supply, 50 odd supply, 50,000 versus 31 demand. So there wasn't a drive to push that beyond what the NPSUD required. In terms of those Johnsonville suburbs, the status quo as notified was MRZ. We went through the phase where, after a very careful analysis, Mr. Wharton recommended, came to a view on the Johnsonville line, and as a consequence, he recommended increased high density. We talked yesterday. It didn't matter in around Johnsonville because of the juxtaposition of the metropolitan centre boundary and the railway station, but it was that was the big difference for all of the intervening stations between Wellington Central and Johnsonville. So he recommended, as a consequence of his view that on balance Johnsonville was a rapid transit line, that all of those stations have had areas of high density around them, and as we've discussed, the council, the commissions came to a different view on the Johnsonville line, which removed the drive to identify high density, but we accepted Mr. Wharton's fallback position that there were some areas of Candala that should be increased from 11 to 14 metres in terms of higher than normal medium density residential.
Also, I just wanted to comment around the medium density. So medium density is around the rest of the city. Does the medium density rules in the proposed district plan also, provide more capacity than the current operative plan rules? I mean, and is that part of the extra capacity that you've identified in the proposed district plan?
Yes, it does, significantly, but I cannot recall seeing a breakdown of, because part of the issue was that's what property economics did. The increase in theoretical capacity, just the theoretical upzoning, if every property took advantage of the zone, was like 212,000. And then property economics went through the phase, well, how likely is this to happen? What's on the edge of a cliff that's never going to be built higher than 1 or 2 stories? What's impractical or uneconomic to build? And they go firstly down to what's feasible, and I think that's the topographical. That's where the seismic risk comes in. They go to what's feasible, and then they have another layer of what's economically sensible, and they peel off. I've forgotten what the numbers were, but I have this. They peel off the stuff that's uneconomic, and what's left is what they term realisable. So that is what they say is economically sensible to build and practical from a physical point, and that's what we focused on. What's the realisable number rather than the theoretical number? So I don't know the extent to which what the balance was in terms of how much high density was identified as being realisable as opposed to medium density, what that balance was, whether it was linear or whether it was skewed one way or the other. If we were told that, I can't recall it.
Okay, and one last small thing. Just in terms of the hearings, if councillors are interested to see you doing things like quizzing the economists or seeing their presentation or seeing the officer's presentation, that's all available on video, so they could actually see literally what you discussed.
So like I've answered a number of questions about how we've seen the economic evidence. Like I would urge the councillors to watch the video of our discussion, particularly in stream 2, firstly with Mr. Cullen and then with Dr. Helm. And I'm sure that the staff could give you, like I have notes as to when they were, but the staff will be able to say, go to 4:42 p.m. to hear Mr. Cullen and sort of thing on this day, so you don't sit through 6 hours of urban design evidence.
Yes, the The recordings have been available on YouTube and through the council website since the hearings. We're currently just making up a list of timestamps for you to help your navigation.
Councillor McNulty.
When someone came to the panel to speak, what constituted providing details in a submission?
It depends what they were talking about.
Okay, so
there's no universal rule, but there's a difference between, and this fades into the issue, the question of what is evidence of fact, what is evidence of opinion, and the classic legal position is that only experts can give evidence of opinion. The only opinions of any value are those of experts. That is softened in the RMA space, but it's still the starting point. And in fact, the Environment Court has sort of reinforced that in its most recent practice note. So,
let me clarify a bit. So if a submitter came and they pointed the panel to direct academic research, or they spoke of their own professional experience, that would be sufficient to have at least provided details on something. Would that be fair? Not analysis, not necessarily evidence, but they provided details. Would that be correct?
Well, I suppose, if I don't know what you mean by details, that it's so. For instance, one of the things that particularly troubled us was that the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development was represented by a lay analyst who didn't subscribe to the Code of Experts, and I asked the ministry's lawyer, well, what weight can we put on his evidence, given he's not purporting to be an expert, but he is telling us, as I said before, the ministry has this information, and here's a series of reports and footnotes that support the ministry's view. And I said, and the answer from the lawyer for the ministry was, well, it's like corporate evidence. What weight do you give corporate evidence? Now, the first thing about corporate evidence is it's not independent. That's a key prerequisite to giving weight to evidence, particularly evidence of opinion, and evidence that it's not irrelevant, but it significantly lessens the weight that you should give to it. And similarly, we heard a lot of impassioned opinions on all sectors of the issues behold, and we gave a lot more weight to evidence of people were telling us of their own factual, like they were giving evidence of fact, like, as I say, the lady in Newtown who said she's walked from Donald McLean Street, she got to John Street, and where is she? She's at the VTNZ. Now, that's a fact, it's not an opinion. And you then fade into the submitters who are making representations who are in the same class as lawyers, who argue a point, and which you've got to be really careful about. Well, what's the evidential underpinning of their argument? Like it's very easy with a lawyer to make that judgment. The classic pejorative description is a lawyer giving evidence from the bar. What's the worth of that? Absolutely nil. But you get lay people who edge into a similar position depending on what they're talking about. So there's no set rules. you have to make a judgment on the subject matter, what they're talking about, and where are they coming from.
Yeah. So I take the point there's a weighting to be applied. So, look, I've considered all the submissions, and in the 1A report, what really alarmed me was you've stated Mr. Garlick of Generation Zero provided no details or analysis of the relationship between upzoning in Auckland and reductions in rents. Now, in the Q&A, he specifically stated, again, I point you to the Infrastructure Commission's work in Auckland, where they painstakingly went through old district plans, and you can see that across the world, in Anglosphere countries, that through the 50s and especially into the 90s, that district plans severely downsized cities, and as a result, prices and rents through the roof. So did Mr. Garlick provide details to your panel, or did he not?
I would have to listen again to the tape.
I've given you factual rundown of what was said, a transcription, so they either provided details or they didn't, and then that goes to the veracity of the report. I just guess it goes to the veracity of submission, so I just want to clarify, is that a mischaracterization of submission?
It might be. I would need to listen again to the tape, and if I've misdescribed, or we have misdescribed Mr. Garlick's evidence, then I would apologise to him. And I and my colleagues wrote our reports on the basis of the notes that we took and the written evidence that we had. This goes back to a point that I made yesterday. I'm not saying that everything in our reports is right. Like, in an ideal world, I would have listened to the entire tape again. I didn't have the time to do that. So I relied on the notes that I had taken of what Mr. Garlick said, and if those notes were an error, then what I contributed to the report was probably an error in that regard.
All right, thank you.
Councillor Chung.
Thank you. I'm a bit scared to say how many questions I'm going to ask, just in case I have a follow-up one.
3.
Heritage site. I'd like to ask a question about heritage sites on the waterfront and in the city. So, how do you use the same criteria for assessing these? Because it seems to me that the waterfront has a larger percentage of heritage sites, but we also have the criteria that stated that you only want 35% maximum density on the waterfront. So, was there a different criteria in looking at these sites and judging which ones were?
If we're talking about heritage, can I respectfully suggest we leave that to next week's discussion when we talk about the heritage chapter? But Robert should talk about the criteria and the generally in the waterfront zone, because that's his baby.
Question, thank you. Well, Mr. Wharton might want to explain, because he was the author of that Section 42A report.
Yeah.
And it wasn't delved into in great depth by submissions and things like that. So we genuinely accepted his recommendations in regard to that.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm happy for Mr. Wharton to expand further, if you like.
Okay, well, or perhaps we can bring this up next week. Yep. Thank you.
Councillor Wineta.
Kia ora. So, apologies to dig back into yesterday, but I just want to talk a little bit more about the idea of this evidential black hole regarding return trips of those who walk to work. So, you have to forgive me, but I need you to unboggle my mind a bit on this. So, how exactly do your recommendations propose that someone who has walks to work might get home? Am I buying a car every day after work and then driving it home and then selling it before my work the next day? Surely there are a very slim number of options if I've walked to work, right? Why did you feel unable to make the assumption that people might simply walk home or take the bus?
So the example I gave yesterday was there is a particular question about whether people walking down from Kelburn would take the cable car back up the hill.
Right.
People walking down from Brooklyn from Northland will take the bus back up the hill. Like, it's effectively, the alternatives are the public transport. So
or walking.
But the question that Councillor Matthews asked me yesterday is why didn't we assume that? Well, we didn't think we could, because there are alternatives, and there's an obvious reason why somebody who's worked all day might not feel like walking up a big hill and might prefer to take the bus.
Goodness. Okay, last question before I go home and walk up Durham Street. I just want to talk about some of the...
Well, can I just
Sure.
Respond to that? I think that's an important... So one of the councillors, I think last week, talked about, well, how do you judge walkability? Is that who are we judging? And that was a particular question. And one of the things that we said was we didn't think we could judge walkability on the basis of fit young things like yourself, and that it was what would most people do? Not all people, because you have people with accessibility issues who can't walk anywhere, and clearly the provisions aren't designed for them. So sorry, I interrupted you, but I thought that was an important, like a link in the chain.
Sure, thank you. That's useful.
What was the evidence that most people would do, and indeed. That was a point on which the council's modelling evidence was criticised, because the council witness said, well, all of the empirical data was of fit trampers who had Fitbits, because they were the ones who could provide the data, but it was skewing the end result. So I apologise.
That's right. Thank you.
On this matter, I would refer the councillors to the published evidence. I would recommend the paper that publishes the methodology for walking catchments. That was ground to truth by a lady in her third trimester, and included both away and toward legs, so it accounted for going up and downhill. However, I would also say that walkability has a range of definitions in international town planning practice, and the weight you decide to place on different forms of evidence would be the basis of an amendment should you wish to make one.
Thank you, Mr. Rodane. That's a perfect segue into my final question. So I noted that some evidence from an urban designer who submitted to you, Mr. Nick Ray, was dismissed in part due to his qualitative description of walkable catchments as, quote, safe or, comfortable, convenient, those kinds of words. But you do note in the report, however, that some subjective judgment is ultimately going to be required, as Mr. Rodane just said. So I guess, can you help us understand what subjective the panel might have applied when you were producing your recommendations?
Well, can I say that we accepted Mr. Ray's point that walkability includes more than just can you walk. It's about the services en route that encourage you to walk. And so the way in Mr. Wharton's 42A report, he had this, what he called a heat analysis, and saying, what are the level of services on the route? And in essence, the fewer services, the smaller the walkable catchment he was recommending, and vice versa. And we thought that analysis had merit. We didn't accept all of his recommendations, but we accepted the essential methodology, which was, if there were more services, more reason for people to walk, then that suggested a longer walking in minutes, and that was essentially why we said, well, our starting point was longer for the CCZ, for the central city, than it was for instance, for the metropolitan centre, there's more reason for people to walk into the central city than there is to walk into Kilburnie or Johnsonville.
And by services, you mean like being able to grab a pie on the way, or use a public bathroom, or is that? But just help me understand. Is this what you mean?
Yes, that's exactly what.
Okay, all right.
And but it's also like parks. It's the pleasantness of the walk. Does it charge people up, to make them ready for the day, or does it depress them?
Okay, thank you.
And final one question from Councillor Matthews.
So similar to a question I asked at the beginning of the session, but I do want to seek some more information about it. And that is, can you clarify to Council that the panel applied the same level of scrutiny to submitters who advocated upzoning or more housing as versus those who advocated for less housing and downzoning, and if at any point the panel considered the relative resources, including time, money, access to professional advice, that those two groups might have that affected their participation in this process?
That if there was any difference, it certainly wasn't a conscious difference. That goes to the point I think I was discussing with Councillor Randall yesterday. The number of questions that I asked individual witnesses depended on their evidence. How many loose ends had they left? How many logic jumps were in their evidence that I needed to probe? So it's not solely a numbers game. But in terms of resources, clearly the most resourced party who appeared in front of us was Kaingora, by a distance. And we did not discount Kaingora's evidence because they had a wall of experts. In fact, they got more airplay because of that, because they had so much evidence, so much of it was expert evidence that we had to pick through. Now, we had a lot of questions for Kaingora, and in stream one, we ran out of time. We sat until 6 o'clock at night. Everybody was a little drained, I have to say, and we could have gone another 3 hours. So we had another go in stream two. So did we discount, reduce the weight we gave to Kaingora's evidence because they were most resourced? No. As I say, they got more airplay than anyone else. I think that was another question I had yesterday. The Onslow people and the Wellington Community Trust, Character Community Trust, had a lot of expert evidence on the Johnsonville line, and we looked at that quite carefully. And the other party, of course, who was highly resourced, is the council itself. And we spent literally days asking questions of the reporting officer and the experts who supported them. So it's a horses for courses. So depending on what the evidence was, some people got more questions than others.
And I think we're going to wrap that up there, exactly on the time, 4:30. Thank you to our panel, thank you to our officers and councillors, and we'll be back next week.